A lot of people think that ISO causes noise in their photographs or videos, but that's not actually true. ISO just amplifies the noise. It doesn't really create it. So in this video, I'm going to show and explain how ISO makes the image brighter and how noise is always present and why ISO is your friend in digital photography and you should really use it because it's there for a reason. Let's go. Now let me first start with this photo example. If I zoom in, you can see that this is quite a noisy image. Now, what ISO would you say this was shot with? 800, 1600, 3200? I mean, it is a noisy image. Well, this was shot with ISO 100. And let me now show you an example of a photograph that was shot with ISO 1600. On the left side, I have the 100 ISO image, and on the right side, I have the 1600 image. And if I zoom in, well, you can see that both photographs have an equal amount of noise. So what's going on? Shouldn't the ISO 100 be cleaner? Now, if I go back to that 100 ISO image, I've actually manipulated it because originally it was shot like this. So this is the exposure that was captured with the camera, and then I just increased the exposure value by 4 stops. And with the other photograph, I increased the exposure with ISO. So I set my ISO to 1600, again 4-stop increase, which is really crazy because increasing the ISO should make more noise, should give me more noise, or the other way around, the image with 100 ISO should have less noise. So let me explain why this is happening. You see, back in the film era, ISO was the sensitivity of the film. So the larger the ISO, the larger the crystals in the film were that would react with the light, making the image brighter. Now this way, ISO directly correlates with the size and the intensity of the grain. The larger the ISO value, the larger the crystals, more grain in photographs, and analog photographers just love the grain. I'm in a photography club and a lot of people shoot on film, and they always say that you must have some grain in your photographs to give it more character, more texture, and well, I kind of agree. I think grain looks really good in photographs. But in the digital era, ISO is not the sensitivity of the sensor. You have just one sensitivity of the sensor. Now what ISO does, it actually amplifies the signal coming from the sensor. So let's imagine that this is the sensor. And let's imagine that the light from the sun is hitting the sensor. Now light comes in form of photons. So photons are the energy that is being transmitted from the sun and captured by the sensor. Now what the sensor does, it transforms the photons into electrons, basically creating an electric current. And that then gets processed by the CPU and transformed into digital data. And that, as a result, ends up as either a raw image or a JPEG image. Now let's look at this a little bit closer. The sensor is made out of little pixels, and every pixel is responsible for capturing its own light and color and intensity and contrast, and it does this by converting the photons into an electric charge. Now let's imagine that we have a 10 millivolt electric charge that gets converted into a really dark pixel on the screen. On the other hand, if we have, let's say, a 100 millivolt charge, then this gets digitally converted into a bright image. Now this is where ISO comes in. If we just change the brightness of the pixels, making the dark pixels brighter, well then we can make that 10 millivolt pixel into a 100 millivolt pixel. Now let's look at it even closer. The electrons get converted into digital data, and this is where ISO can then be used to manipulate the digital data to get a new set of digital information. So for instance, making pixels brighter. Now with this, we're actually increasing the average brightness of every pixel. But there is a problem with doing this. Yes, we get a brighter image, but by increasing the signal, so the light that we wanted to capture, we're also increasing the digital noise that every sensor produces. Now I'm going to show you this in an audio example. Okay, so I've switched to my camera's internal audio. I'm not editing the audio so you can actually hear how echoey this room is. Now if I start whispering and I increase the volume in post-production, you can actually start to hear the noise that the sensor is capturing and the noise of the room. So the signal from my voice actually gets lost in the noise of the microphone and the environment. Okay, let's bring down the volume and switch back to this microphone. So by increasing the volume in post-production, I was increasing the intensity or the loudness of my voice, the signal that I wanted to record. But because I was doing this after the signal was received by the microphone, I'm also increasing the noise level. So this way the signal gets kind of lost within the noise. Or in other words, the signal to noise ratio became weak. Now, because the first photo was really underexposed, there wasn't a lot of signal coming through the lens and hitting the sensor. So in order to make the photograph brighter, I was increasing the average brightness of the pixels, this way increasing the noise of the sensor as well. And it really doesn't matter if you do it with ISO or then later in post-production, the noise level is going to be roughly the same. Now, just for fun, I'm going to show you the third photograph, which was also shot with ISO 100, but this time I was making it bright with the use of aperture and shutter speed. So if I zoom in now, you can see that there isn't pretty much any noise in the photograph. So if I compare it with the original photo, the original ISO 100, now if I zoom in, you can see that the image that got much more light to the sensor is much cleaner. The signal to noise ratio here is much higher than here. And it doesn't matter if I increase the brightness in post or by raising the ISO. The fact still remains that the light that was hitting the sensor was much weaker, therefore it got lost in the noise. But how is ISO then your friend, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video? Well, if you're increasing the ISO in camera, then you can use a faster shutter speed and you will get sharper and more in focus images. And some of you might say, but what about the dynamic range? If you increase your ISO, the dynamic range drops. Well, it's not that big of a drop. And dynamic range is really important, let's say, for landscape photographers. And with landscape photography, you don't have to struggle with fast shutter speeds and motion blur. Well, typically you have your camera on a tripod and enough time to take a photograph. This is why I always say that landscape photography is the easiest photography when it comes to camera settings. Now, I'm not saying that landscape photography is easy, but it is the least challenging in terms of the technical aspects of taking a photo. So in that case, I would rather shoot with the lower ISO and underexpose the photo to get the details in the highlights and then just brighten up the darker areas, this way getting a higher dynamic range. Or even better, take two photographs, one exposed for the sky and one exposed for the ground. But that really works if you have enough time or a controlled environment. Now, I primarily shoot events and these typically take place in lower environments when it gets dark or indoors and there's a whole bunch of movement happening, so I have to use a fast shutter speed. I'm shooting wide open and with the shutter speed of 1/200th of a second or 1/500th of a second, and therefore I have to raise my ISO to 3200, 6400 or even higher. And yes, I get noisy images, but to be completely honest, in the past 6 or 7 years that I've been doing this, I have never had a client come up to me and say, well, Miro, you know, the photos are nice, but they're really noisy. I mean, nobody cares about the noise in the photographs, except, you know, photographers who are pixel peeping like we typically do. And those photos get published on websites, in magazines, in social media, and really nobody talks about the noise. But if you really don't want to have noise in your image, well, then it's best to use an AI noise remover, and Lightroom has a really powerful noise removing tool that does an amazing job of getting rid of noise. And for those shots that have excessive noise, sometimes I use the denoiser in Lightroom and then get a sharp, in focus, non-blurry image that doesn't have a lot of noise, even though it was shot with 6400 or 8000 ISO or something like this. So this is why I said that ISO is your friend. It allows you to get a nice, sharp image. Anyway, that's it for me. I hope you've learned something new. If you did, hit the like button. You're really supporting me that way, and consider subscribing to the channel and hit that bell notification to get notified whenever I upload a new video. So thanks for watching, thanks for supporting me, and if you want to stay on the channel, then, well, click on one of these videos. Thanks, and I'll see you in one of these. Bye bye.